my vlog on Shropshire Folklore of Mary Webb, I mentioned that Mary was heavily influenced by Charlotte Burne, and a jointly authored book, Shropshire Folklore, a Sheaf of Gleanings. I actually find that a Sheaf of Gleanings is ready available both from booksellers and online. So I've decided to begin a series based from the large and detailed book. Where I can, I'll augment it with additional materials. I think I also need to apologise that it'll mostly use still photography that I can find on the internet. As from Indonesia, I often cannot find relevant video clips, and I'm most unlikely to return to the UK again. Charlotte Sophie Burne, or Lottie, 1850 to 1823. Charlotte was actually born just over the border in Staffordshire at Morton Vicarage. It's said that she inherited her interest in folklore from her mother, also called Charlotte Burne, but this time Charlotte Ann Burne, 1820 to 1893. Charlotte's father, Sambrook Thomas Higgins Burne, 1822 to 1861, was born into a wealthy Staffordshire family. He matriculated at Trinity College, Oxford, in 1841, but did not take a degree. But it would seem that he was disinherited by his father. He was assisted by his brother, the Reverend Thomas Burne, whom was the perpetual curate of Morton in Staffordshire. However, the family moved to Summerhill, Edgemond in Shropshire in 1854, having exhausted their welcome at the Morton Vicarage. And Lottie seems to make a big point of this, that she's finally living in Shropshire. But the truth is, all of these places I speak of are just running along the border of Shropshire and Staffordshire. They're very similar places, to be honest. Now, her father's said to have taken to shooting, hunting and drinking. In 1857 he was twice thrown from his horse, and as events surrounding it were somewhat taboo, it's fair to assume that he was drunk, but this led to his premature death in 1861. Lottie suffered a serious illness during her early years. Conditions of ill health and obesity would impede her physical well-being throughout her life. In 1875, Burne became friendly with Georgina Frederick Jackson, who was collecting material for a Shropshire workbook, 1879, and its companion work with the provisional title of Folklore Gleanings. Jackson's demise led Burne to take over her material, adding her own collection of tales to produce Shropshire Folklore, a Sheaf of Gleanings. This probably explains the claim that the book was jointly authored. In the 1890s, she resided at Pulverbatch, Eccleshall, again in Staffordshire, where she collaborated with the local folklorist and folk song collector Miss Alice Annie Keary of Stoke-on-Trent. Together they spent 3 years, around 1890 to 93, collecting material locally in North Staffordshire. While a number of joint papers were published, Burne moved to Cheltenham somewhere around 1894, and the project failed to be realised in a book form. She became the first female president of the Folklore Society, 1909 to 1911, and indeed was active in the Folklore Society for some 40 years. Harvest time in Shropshire is a time rich in customs. It was hard and tedious work and needed to be done before the weather changes so the crop passes their best. Therefore, often small farmers with few labourers would send all to a neighbouring farm to complete the harvest as quickly as possible. As a child, I recall helping with the harvest at a farm in St Martin's near Oswestry. The work was indeed hard, but the farmer took great care to ensure that we also had fun. Many of the customs, therefore, related to the leisure at the end of a hard day's work. This particular tradition comes from Pulverbatch. When the reaping was finished, the reapers had a race. A pail of water was brought into the field and a posy tied to the handle. The goal being that whoever could get there first had the posy to wear in his bosun hat, almost certainly getting a good drenching from the contents of the pail when he disengaged the trophy. In the Bishop's Castle neighbourhood, the ceremony of cutting the gander's neck off was also practised as the end of the reaping. The gander's neck was a group of perhaps 20 ears of corn left standing and knotted together in the middle of the field when all the rest was down. The man standing at from 10 to 20 paces distance threw their sickles at it in turn. The leading reaper first and then the rest in order due. Whoever succeeded in cutting off the neck was reckoned to be the best neon and carried it home in triumph to the master's wife, expecting an extra mug of drink as his reward. The missus who received this offering was supposed to keep it in the house for good luck until the next harvest time came around. Crying, calling or shouting the Mare is a ceremony performed by men of the farm, which is the first in the parish or district to finish the harvest. The objective was to make known their prowess and to taunt the laggards by pretending to offer the oud mare to help them out. All the men assemble, the wooden harvest bottle being, of course, one of the company, on the highest ground of the farm, and they would shout the following: I have her, I have her, I have her. What hast thee, what hast thee, what hast thee? A mare, a mare, a mare. Who is her, who is her, who is her? Maester, 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 naming the farmer whose harvest is finished. Where can shalt thee send her? Where can shalt thee send her? Where can shalt thee send her? To Meister, 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 naming the one whose harvest was not finished. Up, up a hip, 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 hurrah. At Longner, not content with crying or offering the services of the imaginary mare, it was usual to send a mare to the neighbouring farms. The head man of the farmer who had finished the harvest first was mounted on the best horse in the team, and the leader, both horse and man, being adorned with ribbons and streamers, etc. Thus arrayed, a boy on foot led the pair in triumph to the neighbouring farmhouses. Sometimes the man who took the mare received, as well as plenty of harvest ale, some rather rough though good-humoured treatment, coming back minus his decorations, and so on. To lose the goose is a proverbial synonym to overthrow a load at harvest time. In Corvedale, a penalty for overthrowing was to eat the harvest supper in silence, without songs or shouting. But when no such catastrophe happened, the head man would stand up in his place at the end of the feast and repeat the ditty: well ploughed, well sown, well reaped, well mown, never a load overthrown. Why shouldn't we sing? The harvest supper was one great occasion for old-fashioned songs, of which each man had his own special stock, large or small, and he sang untiringly again and again, year after year. Reading about these traditions made me recall the harvest suppers of my childhood. These are mixed with memories of the harvest festival in the church. Whilst fond memories, I'm still struck that even during the 1960s, such traditions were important in Shropshire villages, despite them having already become commuter villages for Shrewsbury. Whilst Halloween was the dominant tradition of my youth, again one which I have very fond memories of, particularly as a teenager, especially a dance that I attended at Crockton Hall. In the past it was more associated with All Saints' Day or All Souls' Day. The sweets now given to children tricking and treating were specially baked soul cakes. Soul to soul for a soul cake. I pray good missus a soul cake. An apple or a pear, a plum or a cherry. Any good thing to make us merry. 1 for Peter, 2 for Paul, 3 for him who made us all. Up with the kettle and down with the pan. Give us good arms and we'll be gone. It would seem that in some parts of Shropshire All Souls Night was actually Bonfire Night rather than November the 5th. And certainly I do recall this time of year being my favourite, with such traditions coming so close to each other. I say my favourite, but of course to all young children nothing can really compete with Christmas. And I have fond memories of going to Auntie Mary and Uncle Jack's in Pontesbury and eating far too many nuts and listening to their Jim Reeves collection. On Saturday, on St Thomas's Day, the 21st of December, every farmer would set out in some convenient place a sack of wheat for the portion of the poor. All cottagers' wives went from house to house for miles around to get their share of the dole, dealt out by the farmers' wives and daughters, or a pint or a quart of each comer, according to their poverty and size of their family. In Pulverbatch, folk used to make the Christmas batch. The Clun people used to get a double dole of wheat for themselves and barley for their pigs. They carried with them 2 small sacks to contain the different kinds. They also adopted a peculiar costume for the occasion, consisting of the oldest clothes in their possessions and, by preference, of their husbands' cast-off smock frocks or coats. In the hills of West Shropshire there was a tradition of lighting the hearth fire on Christmas Eve to continue burning through the Christmas season. Indeed, the 12 nights were what was called Christmas as opposed to simply Christmas Day. The Christmas brand, a great trunk of seasoned oak, holly, yew or crabtree, drawn by horses to the farmhouse door and thence by Ada rollers and levellers, placed at the back of a wide open hearth where the fire was made up in front of it. The embers were raked up to it every night, and it was carefully tended that it might not go out during the whole season, during which time no light might either be struck, given or borrowed. As soon as the brand was safely settled in place, the Christmas ale was tapped, and a great pewter tankard of drink served out to the men who brought the log, who sang a Christmas carol by way of acknowledgement. Shropshire had a tradition of wake holidays. These were normally on the day to which the parish church was dedicated, maybe even the well, although this was often the same saint as that of the church. In larger towns with many parishes, this would mean there would be multiple wake days or half days. A record of Shrewsbury's St Mary's Wake mentions mystery plays on the first day and horse racing on the next 2 days. The Oswestry wakes were celebrated by pony and donkey races in a public street between the church and the cross. Also by races between young women, competing no doubt for a prize smock. A great disorder and riotous conduct seemed to have prevailed on these occasions, whereas in Ellesmere sack racing was popular. Morris dancers, or rather maskers, were also common at wakes. In North Shropshire, however, bull baiting appears to have been particularly popular. However, at Loppington, bear baiting was common, whilst in East Shropshire, cockfighting appears to have been more common. Shrewsbury Show was a possession of the local trades with their emblems and insignia, originally instituted as a part of the ceremonial of Corpus Christi Day. At midday they gathered at the castle, later the market square, with the respective incorporated companies, preceded by the masters, wardens and bailiffs and aldermen. The procession was to St Chad's Church, with the colours and devices belonging and suited to each company or craft. Apparently the companies also lit candles at the altar of St Michael. In the procession the Holy Sacrament was borne under a rich canopy supported by the priests. After hearing Mass the company returned from the church, keeping their respective places assigned to them, the parties being subjected to a fine for non-attendance or non-observance of the order. This was not unlike the Founders' Day celebrations that I attended whilst at school at St Chad's, along with the girls from the Priory Girls' School. The days of entertainment or charters for the several companies were some other time fixed by the masters and wardens. The mayor of the corporation, riding at its head, marched through the principal streets, over the Welsh Bridge to Kingsland, then an open space outside the town walls, and belonging to the burghers. It would seem that Kingsland was chosen because it was outside the reach of more puritanical elements of the town's population. There each trade acquired its own arbour to dine, the mayor and the corporation visiting the different arbours, with one or other of the companies. Indeed, dining halls with long tables were erected in Kingsland. This explains the shoemaker's arbour that I mentioned when talking about Dingle, and why it was originally located in Kingsland. However, Lottie mentions 11 companies: the mercers, grocers, drapers, goldsmiths, ironmongers, barber surgeons, apothecaries, upholsterers, masons, dyers and chandlers. Later then, millers, bakers, cooks, butchers and shearmen, but critically not the shoemakers and cordwainers. Lottie does, however, mention the shoemaker's arbour in Kingsland, which was apparently approached via a maze. Meanwhile, the younger part of the community occupied themselves with sports. In the evening, the procession reformed and marched back to the town by way of the English Bridge, each trade returning to the inn where its own character had dressed, and where the day's festivity was concluded with a dance. Eventually, such was the riotous behaviour that in 1878 the Home Secretary was petitioned to end the Shrewsbury Show. The annual Bailiff's Feast at Ludlow was held on the 28th of October and was a sumptuous banquet, followed the next day by a buck hunt when a stag was set free in the old field. In the evening, bailiffs gave a ball which was the signal for the commencement of the Ludlow assemblies, held fortnightly throughout the winter. This was the custom in earlier years of the present century, of the 18th century, until the Municipal Reform Act of 1835 abolished the bailiffs and their feast altogether. The office of Bailiff of Much Wenlock was abolished by the same act. Here it was customary for the retiring bailiff and his newly elected successor to choose 2 new burghers, whose descendants would be hereditary voters in the borough. At the ensuing bailiff's feast, the top of the mace was unscrewed and a cup which held up 1 pint taken out. This was filled with port wine, and each of the new burghers was required to stand up in turn and empty the cup to the toast of the large table in the middle of the court, and held open to the bailiffs, when each, according to their seniority, takes out a roll. Hiring fairs were common across Shropshire. Those looking for employment would go from fair to fair until they were finally hired. although appear to have been more important in North and East Shropshire, whereas in South and West Shropshire the actual hiring was more of a private affair, following the fair itself. There were also some local traditions by which the hiring might be done at Christmas for the following May, or in Oswestry it was in March, again for the following May. Before the Excise Act, any publican in Market Drayton who nailed a holly bush over his door thereby acquired the right to brew and sell ale freely for the 3 days and 3 nights of the fair. In fact, the Market Drayton Fair was known as the Dirty Fair, owing to its revelry, whereas Church Stretton Fair was known as the Dead Man's, as so many lost their lives crossing the Longmynd going back from it. The feasts of Shropshire were numerous, as every event was made an excuse for festivity. In the woodland districts, bark harvest or the end of the wood cutting and bark stripping season was celebrated by merrymaking of the same character as a wake. In Baschurch and its neighbourhood, the poorer folk, going from the distant Shrewsbury market, would form themselves into parties, take their victuals with them, and on their way home would turn aside into some friendly farmer's field to rest, and there have a picnic meal and a dance on the grass before going home. In Pulverbatch the farmers lugged the blacksmith's coal gratis, and all would agree to do it on the same day, and so fetch a year's supply at once, after which the waggoners were feasted at the blacksmith's expense. The Pulverbatch women spun all their hemp and flax and wool needed for use of the family. It was not surprising that she sometimes found herself behindhand with such an amount of work. She would call her friends and neighbours for help and choose a fine day for that purpose. They would all bring their spinning wheels and spend the day in the garden, spinning thread and yarn for the materials she provided. Shropshire Do was a public or semi-public feast or merrymaking, paid for by subscription and lovingly referred to in after times as this here when the young squire came of age, the do when the heir was born, and the do there was when the Prince of Wales was married. The form of celebration depends on the amount and sum collected, and this again, when local events are concerned, on the importance of the popularity of the family who is desired to honour. At a coming of age, which, as it happens, comparatively seldom, always arouses the greatest amount of excitement, there's usually also a luncheon or a dinner at which the young heir and the father are invited guests. Then there are 3 things that strike me about these traditions. Firstly, the degree to which they are based on and sometimes challenge existing power structures. Thus the rural fairs were very much a part of post-feudal relationships in the countryside, of the manor and the poor. Often these were cemented by and had the approval of the established church. Whilst in Shrewsbury the new merchant class was somewhat challenging the remnants of feudalistic authority, but again endorsed by the established church. My second observation is that often charitable or good causes were used to get around what feels like an overzealous regulatory framework. Many of the dances I attended as a teenager were arranged for different charitable causes, including the one I mentioned one Halloween at Crocton Hall. When I returned last year, it would seem that this tradition is re-establishing itself. I have no idea if this is due to licensing or tax restrictions, but for sure it feels to me like a world is slipping into more overzealous policing of what are very natural things to people. I attended a Northern Soul Old Day while I was there in Shrewsbury that a friend had arranged, and he explained to me now that the only way to arrange such an event was if it was charitable. Finally, how so many of these traditions were still somewhat in evidence in Shropshire in my 1960s childhood. Village fete shared many aspects of what I've described in this vlog. Whilst the Shrewsbury Flower Show is a very much sanditised version of the old Shrewsbury Show, what I recall is that such events were taken as an excuse by young men, and some not so young, to drink an all day, an attitude towards alcohol that I've never fully shaken off. Although I have to say they were a form of communal merriment, a safety valve for the testosterone of youth, with communal disapproval of those who transgressed the unwritten rules, such as not being able to work the next day.